Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Light Haven podcast, the podcast for all things spiritual, mystical, and energetic. My name is Ruth, mystery student towards the awakening of consciousness. And today we have Adonis with us to discuss, to continue on the topic that we approached when we discussed conscious willpower, sort of the follow on from that previous conversation. Hello, Adonis.
Hi, I'm Adonis. I'm also a mystery student and initiate on the path of initiation. I think we broached that topic also a little bit last week, or was it 2 weeks ago? I forget exactly how much time it was, but yeah. So we were talking about conscious willpower and um, the ability to affect reality, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners found that to be maybe provocative or interesting. Um, and I think as a good follow up, it would be to talk about, well, what are the things that create the most obstacles in us being able to utilize these powers, I guess, they want to use the word powers that are within us, right? Is their natural ability that we all have access to. And just from observations and being in many esoteric spiritual communities, it seems to be that the biggest obstacle sometimes in itself is actually that of mystical pride. And I don't mean mystical pride as in someone who is like very overtly becoming like a large cult leader type figure and is like really full of themselves, but I mean in the sense of the identification with our own spiritual path, this identification still with Maya, but we think that just because we have found spirituality and we found these esoteric topics that we are now free from illusion, and we just start to create more illusion, and we stop our progress on the path. So at best, right, we stunt our progress. At worst, we can even start to develop the consciousness through sheer force and will of the ego, and then we become the opposite of what we want to be, even though that uh, we believe to be very righteous. Sometimes we can become a good example would be Agent Smith in the Matrix, right? We start to defend the construct itself, and we're doing this all out of the you know the goodness and the spirituality that we have in our heart. But what really is happening is that we are doing negative things and we believe them to be positive because the ego is tricking us. The ego is clever. They say the pathway to hell is paved with good intentions. And I mean, the most extreme example of this, I used to look at World War II. There was a man who did terrible, terrible terrors to the planet, and he got his start in actually the occult and esoteric ideas. He actually twisted lots and lots of ideals that of like are in esotericism that are not negative, but made them so negative that some of these things we aren't even allowed to say anymore. Symbols, names of people, things like that. So, uh, yeah, I mean, the whole time, right? He thought he was helping humanity and creating a super race of leading humans into the super race, which is the ideas that are actually in spirituality that we can transcend our form and become superhumans. But it isn't certainly to say genocide, like majority of the planet because of their appearance, for example. So like it's something got twisted along the way through his ego. And like I said,
That's
that's
a very extreme
yes,
example.
that is a
Do
very
you have
extreme.
do you have a down to earth example of, say, an everyday spiritual seeker? How does mystical pride manifest for them?
Well, as I was saying before, what where we normally see is rather than starting to get into the negative is what we see as a stunting of progress, right? So when we come across these teachings and we feel we start to grasp them intellectually and we don't actually comprehend them, what the ego can do is the ego can pretend and kind of pretend to be talking to us, such as Source would talk to us, right? So we think we still have yet to learn how to actually listen to our intuition. We have yet to learn how to really listen to the universe when it's speaking around us. But we think because we have these like thoughts and feelings that the ego can control, um, we believe that we are now hearing from God, and you know, the ego tells us this and gets, and then sneakily, even though it makes us feel like we're doing good and we feel good about ourselves, it sneakily turns us away from the things that we actually have to do to awaken consciousness. So we might be like doing the practices, we're not doing them right, we're not actually looking into anything, we're not actually dissolving any of the ego, um, and then that can be a problem, right? It's really tricky because we hear things that say maybe don't resonate with us at the vibrations that we're at a lower state. And what we need to realize is that everything that we like, everything that we dislike, every opinion that we have is ego, pretty much. I mean, okay, maybe 1% actually comes from like the divinity that's within us, but we don't listen to that and we don't hear it. So like everything is ego, even things that we, you know, like that aren't necessarily negative. And it's okay that we have all these egos. I mean, we're here to learn from the construct and be here. But the problem is that, well, we start to have these resistances to things that maybe others further along on the path may, you know, tell us something from that they've learned through direct experience, and we don't like that, right? So there's a resistance there, um, and it's easy, really, right, to find something else that's similar that, you know, lines up with, oh well, like you're being spiritual but it's okay to do this, right? There's a tremendous amount of black magic schools. I mean, there's also just basically organized religion itself, not to offend anyone, but the truth is these are schools that used to be esoteric in value and then were changed by the politics of society and stuff. And it's very easy to be like, I'm spiritual, and now find a different type of spirituality that fits my narrative, as opposed to, you know, we're not trying to, I think a lot of people get um they get paranoid. You know, there's a lot of like, you hear about cults and there's all these things. Nobody wants to get like caught up in something where they can't leave, or, you know, they're forced to pay money. But at the same
But
time,
that's why it's good to have discernment, right? Like if we're
well,
talking
right,
about
there is
joining a
this,
group, you don't have to join a group to be spiritual.
exactly, a true esoteric group or a true mystery school, and there are still a few, um, but most of them can be like misleading. But you know, if you're being asked for money, and I'm not saying like, oh, you can donate or something, but if you're like being straight up asked for to pay for something for spiritual knowledge, that's a red flag. If there's like, you know, you're being pulled into something and then there's a feeling that you can't leave or you're like obligated to be there, that's a red flag. The real esoteric work, you know, there, you're supposed to do the work yourself, right? And when in doing the work yourself, so all that somebody that's further along on the path can do is they can point you in a direction. They could say, well, from my direct experience, I found that this and this, let's say, is not like good for you anymore. Now we can hear that and we might have resistance to it. We need to discern between the fact, are we being controlled, or is there a resistance to something that we don't like because we don't like it? And the issue is that resistance in itself is the ego, right? So it doesn't mean that we have to immediately change and do these things. It's an opportunity for us to observe why there is that resistance, and then explore ourselves. And then naturally, we end up coming to these conclusions ourselves. So you should never feel pressured into coming to a conclusion, but just because you don't like what something sounds, well, then you're supposed to explore for yourself. That's the point. And instead, we give in to these resistances. We give in to these identifications that we have, and we get these feelings like of anger and things like that. And there's this idea that, you know, to be so zen or something, that we don't feel things. But there's a difference between feeling something and observing it and then using it to learn, and a difference between allowing ourselves to identify with it and become consumed, and using excuses. It's like, oh, well, it's natural to have feelings. Well, yes, it is natural to have feelings. And if you have apathy and feel like a robot, that would also be an ego. But we need to understand that observing something and realizing that it's not you is very different from not feeling. The feelings that we get and these, even the thoughts, like, right, negative thoughts, all these negative thoughts and feelings are the most valuable tool for us to learn about ourselves and to actually awaken more consciousness. So we need to be in these situations that are unpleasant, but it's how we react to what is unpleasant that is, you know, how we advance. And you see it all the time in spiritual communities. There's especially, um, there's going to be members there that are more not really truly interested in walking the path. They may be very egoic, and members like this also tend to speak more because, as opposed to more experienced members who may want to let people work through things, there will be certain members who want to answer everything because they're full of pride and ego. And the thing is that for us, when we're new, we need to be able to discern that, oh, well, this person is giving me maybe not great advice, and the only reason I like it is because it strokes my ego, right? Like, people shouldn't be necessarily telling you what something is or isn't. They may give a suggestion. You might not like the suggestion, and like I said, there's times to observe that. But when you have people literally telling you your own psychology and stuff, that's usually a red flag. Even if it sounds good, because it, like, there's alignment with what your desires are. Like, we can fish around, right, and find we could find a person that's saying something in the way that we want the answer to be, and that's not that's the ego. The ego is looking for the answer that it wants so that it can continue to be and exist. So yeah, and that's all. Like I said, it all comes around down to the 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 concept of mystical pride. And this is not mystical pride and, like, I think I'm a prophet, I'm Jesus. Obviously, that is also mystical pride, but it's in the sense of, like, well, we all walk our own path, right? Well, that is true, but it's also, it's not, things aren't black and white, as we talked about with the causal plane. While it is true we all have our own unique circumstances and lessons to learn, in essence, the path that our being has to go through in the internal worlds, that to fabricate soul, there is a process that all of us go through. It manifests differently for each our own unique situations, but to, you know, start to be like, I'm identified with the fact that I'm so unique, well, then you're not disidentifying, and you probably haven't even actually entered the path yet. Because if you're identified with form, if you're identified with the idea of your own personal path, then you haven't actually unplugged from the matrix or the construct whatsoever.
These are very interesting ideas. And I guess I would want to bring some more context to this for some of our listeners who may not necessarily be connected to any of this. So just to back up a little bit and provide some more explanation on what it is that we are discussing, because we are mystery students, so we know a lot of people that are studying the spiritual mysteries from ancient traditions. And when they watch this video, then they'll know exactly what we're talking about. This video is also public to people who maybe are interested in spirituality and they're brand new. So, what I would say to add an additional layer of explanation for what we're talking about, Bianca and I have been discussing for a while how to observe yourself, how to separate between the observer and observed, how to see the egos, and how to work in dissolving them. We've been unpacking this slowly over quite a few episodes recently, because if you have never studied yourself or you've never studied this kind of ancient wisdom, then these things can seem airy fairy or out of reach and just a concept, and they can be something that someone can grasp intellectually but not necessarily practice correctly, which is exactly what you were saying is happening even inside of mystery schools or groups and communities. People are adopting these concepts and this vocabulary, but the inner work is not taking place to the extent that they think it is. And after the passage of time in working with or attempting to work with these tools, then they can start to get puffed up and believe that they have come to a certain level. So, if we are going to explain this process to those who are new, I would summarize it in the way of that all of these tools lead somewhere. And that's what we mean when we say the path. When we say the path, we're talking about a very specific direction that one can go to come towards what has been called enlightenment, liberation. And the reason I'm adding this context is because in our podcast, we never talked about that part before. We've been very much focused on working with the psychology in in the here and now and improving your life. But the next stage of where these tools lead is to have a spiritual life, to gradually achieve fundamental change. And there are steps after that. So we start with the self observation, separating between observer and observed, knowing that we're made of many parts that we could call aggregates or egos. Doesn't really matter what you call it. Working to dissolve these parts of us that bring pain to us and those around us. And then there's more after that. So in the podcast, we can only go so far because it is for a general audience, but for those who are interested, they're welcome to contact us, and we definitely can talk more about these topics. But suffice it to say that there is a whole journey that leads all the way to enlightenment. And some people are on this journey, and other people think they're on this journey. So hopefully that helps what we're talking about to make more sense.
Yeah, there's a great Morpheus quote from The Matrix where he says there's a difference between knowing the path and walking the path. And it's pretty spot on. Um, Sadly, the directors of The Matrix probably had a fall themselves at some point, but at some point they were clearly very locked in on esoteric ideals. And I want to touch on what you actually were just saying in that aspect. So you said you focus mostly on just the observation and the psychology, and really, without getting too deep into these aspects and to not blow people away with mystical occult ideals, really that is what the spiritual path is, right? It is knowing our psychology and working around that to finding our true nature and delete this like programming conditioning like we talked about last episode, the like matrix code, right? You're trying to delete that from our systems, through practices of observation. um, so I mean that doesn't really change, right? The issue is though is getting started, right? The hardest part is getting to the point where we actually have come to the comprehension that the reality is an illusion, and now we're working on our psychological aggregates. That the actual practices don't change too much. Sure, there might be like certain things here for energy work and stuff like that, but in essence, all we do is observe ourselves, and you know we get obviously better at it, and then we get rid of more deeper and deeper seated rooted issues, and as that goes along, we advance on this path internally. So it's not necessarily um, anything super different, right? But there are things that we need to be careful of. And one of those is that the ego, these psychological aggregates, are not necessarily intelligent, but they are very clever, and they know when we are coming for them, and they are able to use their control of our minds, which we are not yet in control of, to trick us into thinking we are doing something when we are not, right? So our willpower, which is what we spoke about in the last episode, is beyond the mind and it's superior to the mind. The fact is, though, we don't access it and we allow the ego to then use it unconsciously because we get trapped in the trappings of the mind and the intellect. And it is the mind and the intellect that rationalizes or makes excuses for us or gives us anxiety and fear and puts doubts in our mind, makes us not listen truly. And really, the most important thing at the beginning is to listen to the source, right? We have to listen, truly listen. The universe is constantly speaking to us all the time. Everything is consciousness, everything is vibrations. I think we might have mentioned this also in the previous episode, but in a sense, like it's not just like straight up talking in your head or it's feelings in the body. It could be a synchronicity in the environment, right? Like in essence, the construct is really just a projection of ourselves because we're made of consciousness and everything is this unity at a certain level of existence. So there's always signs. The more you awaken, the more you notice everything. The most insignificant little thing could be a sign. So how do we connect to that knowing? And we think that because we study a little bit or we now grasp some concepts with our mind, which our mind actually cannot grasp or ever connect to this superior level of knowledge. But we think that, oh, now we know things. We're listening to God, of course, because He's speaking to me. I hear Him right now. These are my thoughts. Like, well, that's not God. That's the ego, right? That's we have the angel and the devil on our shoulders. They're that's basically what it is, right? Here's your actual intuition that you're not really listening to, and the little devil is here, and he's like, oh yeah, you should listen to me. And we usually listen to that guy because he comes through a little bit more clearly because we're not in tune to listening to this one. But they're both there, right? And yeah, that's the biggest thing at the beginning is learning to truly listen to that. And it's people don't realize it's not something that it's just like, oh, like I now I listen to source. It's a knowing. It's when you're connected, right? And I'm not gonna act like I'm spiritual master and that I'm walking around all day connected to source, but in little bursts, when we have these downloads, as some people might call them, or comprehensions, right? We know that the universe is speaking to us. And it's just that's what we should be looking for and not really like trusting the things that are in our mind because everything in our mind is designed to trick us and we're supposed to learn from these things, right? uh, so there's that aspect. And also, I mean, even for you know people that have large amounts of consciousness waking up, maybe even like more than myself, I would say there's a lot of people that had spontaneous awakenings, for example, but they still have not detached from the construct. So for example, they may have psychic abilities opened up. They may see elementals in the environment, but they're still attached to physical form because they haven't done the work to detach from that, right? You could, you know, still think of the body as like part of you and not realize that you're really a being of light. So just because you have more abilities, there's um, well, I don't know if I want to get into this too much, but I'll say it just really quick. There's even beings and races on other planets that are more advanced and clearly more consciously advanced than humans that are also living within the construct and have no concept of, well, they do have a concept, I guess, suppose, of the causal dimensions and stuff, but to them it's just, oh, they're beings that have evolved further because their idea is of this physical reality and they're obsessed with physicality and they're still attached to the material. So in their concept of things, they have no concept of internally evolving oneself. In a way, they're not wrong, right? We do have to evolve into these beings, but they think it's like something that you do physically and your species evolves, right? Um, and
Okay,
that
so
would be wrong.
what I've heard, two things that you've mentioned. You've talked about listening to source, and you've talked about detaching from the construct. So for the benefit of all who are on board and they want to make these changes, maybe they're very sincere students of the path or spirituality, or they are working with psychology, whatever the person that's listening who has decided, yes, I want to make a change, can we separate out and go step by step with these 2 points? Someone who is not sure if they have been listening to source or their ego, we'll start with that one first, and then we'll come to detachment. What should someone do when they say, yes, I want to listen to source? How do I start to build this connection? And how can I trust it? How can I know?
Well, first and foremost, the most important practice towards working towards connecting ourselves back to our true spiritual nature is meditation. And meditation with the intention of quieting the inner self and dissolving the chatter, the psychological aggregates that surround us.
And what
Outs-
is meditation? Because there's a million and one definitions and instructions as well. So some of our listeners may understand meditation to be A, and some understand it to be B. So for the purpose of what we're saying, what do we mean?
well, meditation is being able to basically still the mind enough that you can detach from the construct. But our goal at first is not really to reach samadhi. I mean, I would be at miss if I were to say that that's something that I even do myself all the time. So we really, that's like maybe the goal in totality. But when we're first doing our practice, it still is useful for receiving information from source. And how can we do that? It is to relax ourselves and to really learn to clear the mind of all images and thoughts and begin to withdraw from the physical senses and reach like a state of inner stillness. Um, at first, really, the goal of meditation is just to reach that state. Uh, I know a lot of people will sometimes get distracted with the sensations because there's a lot of nice energies that come up in the body and stuff, but you can't be distracted by those either. Um,
Some people, when they tell me when they sit down to start meditating, they can't deal with all the thoughts and images coming up, and they don't know how to get past that into a state of stillness.
Yeah, the goal is to learn how to like, ignore that, and in a sense, it's it's not so much of a we don't have to try like forcefully to get it to stop because that will just create more resistance, right? Like as we said before, thoughts, all these images, these visualizations that we have, which are also thoughts being visualized, if we can visualize, all of these things, right, are ego. So when we try to forcefully stop the ego, we're going to be met with resistance because we haven't actually detached from it. It's more, I would say, if we just kind of stop and let it be and let these thoughts just go through, like a good example would be when a child throws a temper tantrum, right? Like if you ignore it, eventually the child runs out of steam, it doesn't get its way, and it stops crying or stops throwing the tantrum, right? Or whatever, breaking things. And the ego sort of can be like that as well. So if we just sit there and observe the thoughts and don't really like think, like dwell on them, judge them more, or try to stop them, and we just let them be, they'll slowly slow down and stop themselves. So it's really important to just relax, maybe focus on the breath. Um, but we want to get to
That was
that.
an important key, what you said, that not following the thoughts along and getting lost in thought, but not resisting. So it's that neutral balance between getting carried away or trying to fight them.
I also think it's important not to be concerned about time either. At the beginning, it may take a real long time for our mind to quiet down. We may sit down and say, "Oh, well, I need to get to this point in 30 minutes." And well, we're sitting there for 30 minutes and the mind's still chattering, chat, 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 chat. And well, we're like, "Well, I'm done meditating because it's been 30 minutes." Well, it's not exactly how it works. We need to get to that point where it gets quiet, and if ideally we would like to in most of our sits get to the point where we at least withdraw from the senses, because when we're at the point where we like kind of withdraw from the physical reality around us, even if we don't get any images or we get nothing comes through from source yet, even if we're not that great at receiving, we're reaching the state where we would receive. And then when that becomes consistent in our practice, it doesn't matter if we receive something every single time we sit or not, we'll be capable of receiving. And in that state, really at the beginning of our practice, it's more up to divinity. Our abilities aren't developed. It's more up to what the universe wants to show us when it wants to show us. And it's not like an automatic, like I sat down and I had a good sit and I quieted my mind and now I'm going to get visions. It doesn't work that way. Um, so there's that aspect too, like no expectations. And it's okay if we just reach that state and nothing happens. Like that's okay too. It's the ego that wants something to happen, that we're chasing these experiences. So there's that aspect of it as well. And the other thing to remember is when we do start to early on get fleeting experiences, and this could also apply, I would say, to dreams, which is another way that divinity will try to contact us. But we have to remember that we are still full of ego, so that these things are also very subjective. So you see this a lot with a lot of times people that have had spontaneous awakenings. So they have these spiritual experiences that come through a lot because they've just awakened a bunch of consciousness, but they haven't really detached from ego, in that they are getting some type of information from the universe, from source, in a download, and there's truth there, like even from an outside perspective, more objective perspective, there's truth there, but then they're adding all these subjective twists onto it that like fit a narrative or something, that something that's fear based or anxiety based or intellectual based, trying to explain something that's more abstract. A lot of the time things will be more abstract and there's not necessarily words for it, so we try to put words to it. We need to be careful not to do that as well. um, but yeah,
Is
it
there anything that people will be familiar with that fits within this description to help them know what you're talking about?
well, yeah. Here's an easy one that probably everybody has had multiple times in their life: a vivid dream, right? I mean, yes, it could be very subjective, and you know, symbolically, we might be seeing something that represents an ego in us, and some type of silly thing that relates to a TV show that we like or something. You know what I mean? But within the narrative, there's some underlying psychological element that we're, if we were paying attention, hopefully able to like understand and comprehend out of that.
Right. And then the person who misunderstands it may come away and say, I understand that I am a reincarnation of Cleopatra, because they put their own lens on it.
Exactly. And really what happens is that, you were shown some type of ego that you have, and maybe you have an affinity for Egyptian mythology, and this ego in the dream manifested itself as, this queen, and now you think you actually were that queen in a past life, which would be in error. So we can visit past lives, by the way. That's a little bit more advanced than probably not for this episode. But yeah, most of the things that happen in our dreams, especially like when they're dreams that aren't lucid, that we don't have conscious control over. I mean, it's great that we start to remember our dreams, because that is a step forward in consciousness. But we have to remember that almost like everything that we're seeing in the dream world is completely subjective and clouded by our ego, because the ego is so active in our dreams because we're sleeping at night. So while there's value there, we have to realize that there's also a ton of subjectivity.
Right. So this is what people can start to do when they want to learn to hear from source, and as they are careful and intentional and they begin to maybe receive guidance in the form of visions or some kind of an intuition, a feeling, a knowing that comes from their meditation or their dreams, then how about when they are not meditating or sleeping, when they're just going through daily life, and again they're very new to these things, what can they do or not do, stop doing, to make sure that they are listening to source?
Well, it's very important to just stop and take take awareness in the present moment as much as possible. I mean, we're bombarded with impressions and stimuli all day, especially if you live in a big city. You know, we're constantly being like hypnotized from all different directions. So if before we're really trained to realize everything that we're processing or not processing and but taking in anyway, um, the best way is to, I even set random alarms on your phone, and whenever it goes off or something, just take a few deep breaths, try to, think of like where you are, how you got there, uh, what are you thinking, what are you feeling. Just observe all these things. No judgments. It doesn't really matter. It's more just being present, not thinking about the future, not in the past, not daydreaming, and just being in the now, in that moment. The more we do that as we are awake in the awake world, we also will have more likely chances of like waking up in our dreams as well, which is a very useful realm to explore an inner state, considering we are like in our inner state at that point in time. But yeah, it's really important to observe, and it's just as important to be suspicious of subjectivity. And that's, like I said, that's where the mystical pride comes in. And it's like, yes, we, you know, created these egos. Um, some of them could be like conditioning that was like planted in us and karmic, but a lot of it's just because we like things, right? We get attached to things, we like them, and we create egos, and then we're supposed to learn our lessons and then detach from them. But we, created these things, and now we have an affinity for a lot of these things. And
What
we have
about
to ask ourselves, a lot of times, when we think we have intuition or we think we are, you know, getting this divine message that goes along with something that's pleasurable for us. What are the real motives there? Are we listening to God and doing this for a truly altruistic, sacrificial reason? Or is it a good thing that also is in line with bringing us a desire, or avoiding facing our fears and anxieties? Or, is it out of pride because it makes us, feel better about ourselves or superior to others? All of these things are not from source, but they could be masked in of, I'm doing this nice thing, so I'm making this donation so I can feel like so good about myself, or I'm gonna go and make sure everybody sees how generous I am and I'm helpful to other people on social media because like I'm so spiritual. Like, no, you're not in that situation. To be truthful, you may be doing something with the external illusion of being spiritual, but you're doing it to stroke your pride. So yeah, there's a lot of that, and especially fear-based things. There's a lot of, I'm gonna do this because it allows me to avoid the facing the things I'm scared of about myself, which is a huge deterrent to actually beginning the work, because then you're not doing anything. You're just lying to yourself, and you're lying to yourself and just staying stagnant.
one thing I want to unpack is, you mentioned life in a busy city and impressions, and how we're bombarded by so many things that call for our attention. we're talking about someone who is walking a spiritual path, and the pitfall of mystical pride comes from believing that we are doing certain practices, but we never even learned how to listen to the universe or divinity. So now we're offering some suggestions for the remedy, and being lost within impressions and illusion is a big way that we stay asleep, that we don't begin to wake up and see reality. Can you talk a bit more about impressions and those constant things that crop up and vie for our attention?
Yeah, so let's imagine we're walking in the middle of Times Square, right? And there's cars, there's honking, there's people everywhere, people bumping into you, being loud, taking pictures of things. There's the big billboards that are like electronic and flashing colors all over the place. And there's all these things going on around you. And can you walk through that and self-remember and realize that you are not your physical form and that this reality around you is all illusion and that you're this eternal being that's just going through a lesson, right? The answer probably is no, right? Because you're taking in all of this. But a true master, for example, could go sit in the middle of Times Square by the place where they have the uh, Broadway tickets, right? Like right in the middle, that spot, that little like triangle, and sit there and meditate and go into samadhi, right? That's like a spiritual master could do that. So it really doesn't matter, how much noise there is, or even if there's people brushing by you, or all of that, because you're not becoming identified with your surroundings, right? So um, that's why we talk about impressions. This is literally everything that comes in, like everything, whether it's TV, when you open the phone and you look at social media, everything that we take in sensory. So that could be visually, auditory, through the sense of touch, taste, when we eat something, right? All of these things are impressions. And when I say the word impression, I mean something that we are then relate to something and create a conditioned response. So whether it's positive or negative, right? Like if I mentioned food, this food, I like the way it tastes. Now I'm conditioned to like this food, and I form an ego around this is something I like. Whereas this food, I don't like the way it tastes. I want to spit it out. I've now developed a conditioning that is an aversion to that. And anytime I see that, every time I taste that food, I don't like it, right? That I've
What
created
about
this
people that
false
say
system.
there's nothing wrong with that?
Well,
The specific example of, say, an ego that likes to eat a certain food, they might say, well, what's the big deal?
well, right. So there's not necessarily a big deal in liking something or disliking something. The issue is in becoming identified with it. And this is where we come back to, right? We can taste something and know that it tastes good, but when we become like, like that food is what I'm about, or like, I can't eat that because it's so gross, right? We don't have to like the way it tastes. We also have to realize that it doesn't really matter, like, because it's not real. It's just an illusion, right? The thought that makes us think this tastes gross and the thought that makes us think that this tastes good is in itself an ego. So like as long as we are aware of that, that doesn't mean we have to go around doing things we don't like. But are we aware that it's not us that dislikes or likes this thing? And there's a big difference with that, right? Then it doesn't become a thing like that. Doesn't, so like for example, if I'm there's something I don't like to eat. We'll stay on that example. If there's something I don't like to eat, I obviously usually don't eat it, right? But if I'm not identified with that fact, let's say I go to someone's house and they cook up something with this in it, right? And normally, if I'm identified with that, I'm like, that's gross. I can't eat that. That's bad for me. Like whatever reasoning it is, right? We can come up with a million different reasons why we won't eat that thing. But you realize that, this person made that, and maybe it's just nice to not say anything, take that, eat it, whatever. To be honest, karmically, that is the truth. Somebody's slave to do something for you. There is a benefit to just doing the right thing, and you would suck it up because it's like, well, this doesn't taste good to my palate, but who doesn't it taste good to? My ego, not me. The
So I should cook you some mushrooms.
basically, um, but you understand what I mean, though, in that sense.
Yes, I
So,
do. So we're talking about liberation. And that leads me to the second point that I wanted to touch on, and we're already kind of unpacking it. We've been discussing this detachment from the construct. Okay, so we're using this vocabulary to describe non-identification, liberation, freedom. Someone who is very attached to everything in life, what they can touch, taste, feel, desire, pleasure, what they are pursuing, their goals and their dreams, things that make them feel prideful and superior. And they think, this is so good. It's so nice. What can we share with someone like that to help them see through this illusion? And besides that person that is identified, someone that is really trying and they don't know a way forward, they don't know how to disidentify.
well, realistically, if someone is completely identified and enjoying, there's not much we could do for them. I mean, we can't force somebody to not identify. I think of uh, the example, another example. So I've used the Matrix so often, and this would actually be someone. Actually, wait, I'll come back to this. Actually, anyway, the point is we can't make somebody, you know, disidentify from something because it's like that's their choice and everybody has free will. I mean, if we explain to them really, I mean, at that point, you're explaining somebody who is identified with their role in the construct, right? Like it's like Agent Smith or something, right? It's like if you were to say, um, try to tell them that like, oh, you're not you and you need to know who you really are, their answer to you will be like, well, I'm this person that does this job and this and this. And if they're attached to that, they'll never be able to detach from the construct because they don't even know their the true identity of their actual like soul and essence. But as far as for someone who is trying, and just maybe getting caught up in this thing, it's just that to remember, like I think as I said earlier, is that any type of resistance to anything should be observed. It doesn't mean this is right or wrong. It's not saying like this is not to control somebody or telling somebody like, oh, as soon as you are angry about something, that means you have to drop that behavior. No, because really we have to comprehend anyway and learn about these things, right? So it's not for me or for anybody else to tell somebody what to do or what not to do. But the advice would be if you're experiencing resistance about anything that comes forward, right? Like there's something there that is involved with our ego. Because like I said, what we dislike, what we like is related to ego, even if it's something that's good for us, right? So when we experience it, it's just an opportunity for us to explore ourselves instead of, avoiding anything that it has resistance because it's convenient and it's hard to go and to fight against this resistance, and that's where you'll move forward. And there's also a sense, and I'll actually now come back to the example I was gonna make, that they're karmically right. So if we talk about somebody who is completely ignorant and just like they're in the construct and they're like, my name is Joe and I'm a plumber and that's all there is to life, right? They don't really get bad karma for doing things that are egoic because they don't know any better. But there is to some extent the idea of once you become become knowledgeable about these teachings, right, and you start to practice, and now you have are familiar with the concepts, and then you continue to, I guess, feed the ego that there's karma behind it, and obviously, in the worst case scenario, would actually be more of somebody who has already like detached from the construct and going back. Two examples. One was the one I was thinking about in the past because we were talking the Matrix, with the guy who goes and like betrays Neo, and you know he like just he's like he knows better, and he's just like but like I love this steak and I want to identify it. I'm going to choose to identify with this, even though, and there's severely negative karma attached to something like that. The other example I would think of that many Christians might be familiar with Sodom and Gomorrah and the symbology of when like Lot and his wife are walking out and they're being initiates, right? And God says, don't look back, right? Don't look back, right? Just keep walking the path and don't worry about it. There's whatever you're attached to doesn't matter. Just let it go and just surrender it. And but when she turns back, she gets turned into salt, right? And that's what happens. Like if you know better and you've left the ego behind, and then you're like, but I really like it, and I want to come back. Then the karma is severe, and that's what happens to. I mean, well, like, people that choose a path of awakening consciousness through the ego. But we don't need to really get into that deeply at this point in time.
Yeah, I would say regarding just briefly regarding that example of Sodom and Gomorrah, that it's a symbol of leaving behind a life where we were chasing things that made us feel good, but in specific reference to some of the details of that story, we are by no means singling out any groups or not supporting people who make certain choices. We are simply looking at the symbology of the myth, and we are not saying that that is a real story or that some of the hatred and bigotry that has come out of many mistaken ideas around that story, we are not supporting any of that, but it's more just the concept of looking back at where you came from and wanting to go back to indulgence, shall we say.
Yes, that's absolutely true. All beings are one, so we're in no way looking to put down or marginalize any groups of people. There's a unity and a multiplicity, as we talked about the prior episode, but we're all one and yet also all individual at the same time. But at the same time, all of us are, in essence, our own God, if we can reach that potential.
Right. Oh, but not someone else's God. Very important.
Yes,
And
yes. You
the
can't, which is why everybody must do the work on their own, and why, like I said, when one of the red flags of a group tells you, "Oh, this is how you have to do it," or "You believe this," or you can't leave," and all these things, that's even if they're giving you maybe some of the practices and the wisdoms of esotericism, that's a red flag that it may be a school of the, I guess, dark arts. I don't like using like evil and good, but just something that is leading you towards an egoic awakening, which leads
mm,
to very bad karma later on in existence.
you also mentioned a term that we've never introduced on the podcast before, and that is self remembering. So, because it's come up, we're going to talk about it now. And I think it will be very educational and beneficial to the listeners. So, can you briefly, at an introductory level, give us a run through of what we mean by self remembering, what are the benefits, and how to do it?
Yes, so when I talk about self-remembering, and maybe again to harken back to what we talked about last week, it's the concept of, so, right, we have these multiplicity of all these psychological aggregates that are constantly taking us over because we're unconscious and asleep at the wheel of our vehicle, and they create these false versions of us. And in essence, our actual self, or as they would say in New Age, your authentic self, right? When you're aligned with your higher self, you act as your authentic self, is when the vessel is being controlled by your soul, your being, higher self, whatever, right? So when we talk about self remembering, it's the difference between like being in the present and connected to that stream, and it doesn't even need to be like necessarily a divine experience at that point in the moment, but it's just like being aware that you're not all these things that are in your, I guess, like sphere is a good way to think of it, but like in your orbit, all these like thoughts and emotions, everything that's around you is not you, and just remembering that these things are not me. Who is me is I am the one observing these things, right? And it's just being able to remember that then allows us to observe the things that are causing us suffering, and eventually maybe later on take them into meditation and remove them from our psyche.
Great. And when someone wants to practice self remembering, how do they do it? Is it something that they do in the morning, or Is it something that they do in the afternoon? Do they schedule it, or what's the process?
It's something we do in the now. And I can't stress that enough. I mean, there's never a future or a past time that you do this. You do this now, and then you do it in another now, and then you hopefully do it every now for the rest of existence because time is an illusion in itself. Time, yes, it's a dimension though, like how we move through space. Like if we were in the fourth dimension, we could move through time. Um, the effect of time, though, as we know it, as we like move through time, because we're living in a three-dimensional world, it's not real. It's an illusion. And higher planes of existence, everything is in the now and exists all at the same time.
Hmm. So, to summarize, someone who wants to take up the practice of self remembering and they set the intent that they're going to do it, it shouldn't be, okay, I'm going to start this from tomorrow, but I'm going to start this now. And then they hold the intention to remember their authentic self from moment to moment and continually remind themselves to remember their higher aspect, their higher wisdom, whatever you want to call it. One of my favorite ways that I've heard it described is to remember your being, because that also reminds you to be here and now. And we've heard that advice in so many different spiritual schools. Those who have applied it have noticed the benefits straight away. Remember your being means to remember the higher self, to remember God inside of you, to remember the light within you, the divine spark, the essence, whatever you call that. Now, there are a lot of people, and we've been talking about mystical pride, who say, I'm remembering my being because they've been studying these tools and they also believe they are hearing from their being. But it's the same question. How is this happening that they are sometimes feeling that they're remembering their being, but then receiving information that could be misguiding them?
Well, like I said, the ego itself is clever. It knows it can pose as um, it could pose as our essence. It could pose as like our higher self. Um, Also, it's very easy for it to get this bias early on when our experiences with source are either non-existent and we just believe we've had some, or we've had some but they're very subjective because we still are attached to reality. So even when God speaks to us, right, it's through a lens of ego. So we're still like it's a little bit like fishy, and there's still like some information that's coming through that's stuff that we planted there. Well, not us, but the ego is planted there. So then other like allowing it to kind of cloud and shift the knowledge. Um, yeah, it's just we just have to be careful, like to really question and just discern the subjectivity of the experiences that we have until we actually have experienced objective reality. And if you were to ask, how do you know one has experienced objective reality? You will know. It would be something. It's something that's so different and abstract from this 3D plane that you will know. Also, there is an all sort of an all knowing that happens when that happens as well, because you're kind of connected into like all of the knowledge that is and will be there. So like, I mean, if you haven't experienced that, and that doesn't mean that you haven't have heard from source and that you haven't had experiences. Like I said, we can, even a vivid dream is usually some type of message from divinity, right? If we were conscious enough to remember our dreams, like there's definitely messages from divinity. But until we've experienced that objective reality, we can't definitively say, oh, this experience is 100% true. So we have to look at it through the lens of where is the ego in this, even when it's coming from source.
And what about classic excuses that the ego of mystical pride gives, or these false lenses that tell us this is a message from source, but it's the ego. What are some of the things that these egos say to deceive us?
Well, first and foremost, like I said a little bit earlier in the episode, is the fact that when we hear advice or hear things that we don't like, the ego is quick to be like, well, we all walk our own path, right? And nobody can tell me about my path. I know better. That's like the biggest, most common thing, right? And like I said, yes, there's truth to it because everything the ego always uses something with a semblance of truth. That's why it's so easy to trick us, right? It's never like something that's a bold lie unless we're like, I guess, really, really unconscious. There may be certain situations where somebody is just like completely delusional. But for the most part, usually these things have an element of truth to them, right? So, okay, we'll take that. Well, we each have our own path, and nobody could tell me what to do with path. I do the work for myself, whatever. But nobody's telling us what to do in the moment. Somebody may just give us a suggestion to think about it, but we don't want to think about that. So we immediately have resistance to that. And then we're like, well, I know better, and I walk my own path, so I'm never going to actually take this advice. Or, you know, it'll use time. So it'll be like, well, that's really painful and I don't want to face that all at once right now because it just hurts too much to face it right now, these traumas, and I want to get rid of these traumas. But if I if I wait till later to face them, or like, oh, I'll just do that later, well, later is never happens because the future doesn't exist. There's only more nows. So if you're always saying, oh, well, I'll just get around to that later, or I'll work on that aspect later, well, then you're not, it just has you delay it indefinitely. So it's another trick that the ego uses as well. Um, and then there's plenty more too. I mean, we can project onto others sometimes. Maybe if we don't like the advice that we get, well, we'll be like, that person's being arrogant and they're full of pride, or maybe it's they're mean and abusive or something like that. And really, that's our own inner perception projecting as well, because someone could literally give us advice that's neutral, and we could even get the same advice from multiple people that's neutral, but based on, well, I have a problem with this person right now because they told me something I didn't like. So I'm angry about. I hear that they're being mean to me and being angry. Now, so this other person tells me the same thing, but because they're on my good side, oh, they're affirming everything that I said, even though they didn't, right? We just hear what we want to hear. This person's my enemy, so they're saying something I don't like. This person, I like them, so they're just telling me what I want to hear, even though they're telling me the opposite. And that's what how the ego says. It just everything is flying over our head. We're not actually listening to the advice that's coming down from source through people that are further along the path. Because what also ends up happening too is as some of the more advanced students, because they are connected to source, when we ask them questions, the answer that comes down is unfolding down from their being to tell us. So, the same answer will come from multiple people. They all will say the same thing, maybe in their own way with through their own personality, but they're saying the same thing. But we can pick and choose what we like to hear or what we think we're hearing because we're not actually listening. And basically, the entire thing is going over our head, and it can go over our head. There's people that could be in the practices for years, and they still haven't learned how to listen and truly listen to source. You know, we have to listen, comprehend. There's also the fact of not speaking so much and thinking we know. And when we think we know, we're just chatter, chatter, chatter. And we want to tell everybody else all that we know. And really, it's making up for the fact that we don't. Anybody who has walked even a little bit of this path will tell you we know absolutely nothing. I mean, the more that you do start to learn, the more questions arise. All right, it's not like, oh, now I have the answers to the universe. It's usually like we have a few fleeting experiences, and we're like, oh, I can't wait to like find out what this means, and I'll get a little more consciousness, and you like awaken a little bit more, and your level of being goes up a little bit, and then you realize, oh, Well, I got some answers, and now I have even more questions because like what I thought the answers were gonna be, or like like somewhere in that range, it's so much more complex and complicated than that. That now I just there's even more stuff I don't understand. So maybe it's better to not worry about all these things, and that's an ego in itself too. The desire to know everything. Like I said, anything intellectual is basically ego. So yeah, and the ego knows
Does
how to
the
trick us.
the intellect have a place, and if so, what is it?
Well, the intellect does have a place in the sense that it's part of this physical machine, and it allows us to interact with society and like do practical things in this reality when we're the ones in control of it and we're using it. Like, right, if we use our mind to do some numbers, right, that we did some math, that's not a bad thing. That's not the ego to do an equation. But the issue is that the mind is out of control because the ego uses it. The ego also uses our emotions and other things as well, but the mind especially can is like usually the last thing we have to conquer on the path. It's represented by I think Jesus on was it Palm Sunday when he comes riding the donkey. I don't know, but
Oh
that
yes.
image,
Well,
yeah, that image
let's
is
just
of
explain
him.
that a little
Yeah,
bit
so
for
so
people who don't know.
the donkey represents the intellectual mind, and him riding it in like victoriously, valiantly, or whatever is the symbol of him conquering the mind, and now he's in control of the mind, and the mind listens to him. That's why he's writing it. There's also that Buddhist painting where like the monk chasing the elephant, and as he goes up the road, it slowly turns from black to white, and it gets purified. And at the end, also the monk is now sitting on top of the elephant that was like running away from him, and that signifies that he's tamed his mind. So it's a very common trope in most like religions and practices, but yeah, I mean, if we get to that point where we've like eliminated the ego from the mind and the mind is under our control, like you think of a Jedi, right? Then we can use the mind to do great things, right? Um, but at the beginning, and for a very long time, even past the beginning, the mind is definitely usually our enemy. I would say the intellect is because we don't have the capability of using it at will, you know. So we have to. That's actually something that we have to get control of before, even before willpower. So um, it's another
And
obstacle.
and is it using the same methods that someone gains control over it?
Yeah, I mean the methods on the path stay the same, right? Whether we're starting out at the beginning or we're just trying to, heal some traumas so that we could detach from the system, or we're, further along on the path and actually trying to cleanse our emotions or our mind or even our willpower of all the aggregates that are there in the deep recesses of our mind, um, or our psyche, I think is a better word for that, because not to get confused, because the psyche also includes the emotional center and like the center of willpower and things like that. So, yeah, um, the practices are always the same, right? It just the hardest part is getting to the point where you're detached, right? It's almost as if it becomes like a snowball effect as we gain further depth. I would say like most masters, right? They say it takes many lifetimes to become a spiritual master, but usually in the incarnation that they become a master, they've like through many lifetimes just gotten to the point where they're over the edge, and they're starting from like birth or relatively shortly after birth, like boom, I'm detached from the construct, and then in like 20, 30 years they can like wipe out the entire ego because they're aware of it, they're constantly observing, and then you also start to develop abilities as you awaken consciousness, which just make it even easier and easier to start wiping out the ego. But it's those like first baby steps that we have to take to just enter the path. Like I said, actually entering the path internally and starting to work on these defects, as opposed to just doing the practices and saying that we're doing it while still running around attached to the matrix. So that unplugging that Neo has to go through, that's could take multiple lifetimes in people, and it's the biggest struggle that we face on this journey.
Hmm. So many good points that I think no matter where someone is at, there will be something that people can start to do. So if you are completely new to doing the inner work and all this sounds like a lot, then the starting point is to have a daily practice, to meditate, to observe. And then the path going forward is no different. It's just deeper and deeper levels of remembering the divinity within, observing what is inside of you and how you are reacting, and deepening your meditation practice. So, thank you so much, Adonis, for sharing these things with us. And thank you to all of our listeners who have come along on this journey. And remember, the path to your best reality is in your hands to create when you become conscious.
Yes, and remember to vibrate at a higher frequency so you can maximize Dharma for the collective. And one last thing, I'll just put a pitch out there, but we should bring some of our friends on here to talk about human design. I know there's one that would probably love to be on the podcast. And also, I haven't spoken with you and Bianca on one at the same time. So we'll
Yeah,
put that out
yeah.
there.
I think
We'll,
Bianca
we'll put
would
that out
love
there
to have.
so anybody listening can put some pressure
Yeah,
to make
I
that
think
happen.
Bianca would love to have a conversation. And there are quite a few friends actually that we have on a list that have already agreed to come on the podcast that we are just looking to find a time to book it in because they're in different time zones. But I think there's so much more that we can unpack, and we have so many beautiful, precious souls that we know that have something to share that can really benefit people. So, yes, definitely keep following and keep watching because there is more good stuff coming. Thank you, everyone.